Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to be discussing three distinct topics. The first one is going to be the continued appreciation of the Armenian dram against the primary currencies of the world, the euro and the dollar. The second issue is going to be this week's announcement by the EU, essentially a no for the current candidacy of Georgia to become a member of the European Union. And third one we're going to be discussing is this week's attempted murder of Azeri dissident Mohammad Mizrahi by the Aliyev regime in Paris. Let's start off with the background on the issue of the dram's appreciation. Contrary to what many people expected, post the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the dram has actually gained strength, and it's trading somewhere in the 410 to 420 range to the dollar, which in real terms has gained around 20% since the beginning of this year. This has led to sort of a war of words between the head of the central bank, Martin Galastyan, and a lot of business leaders. The two most vocal groups have been people from the IT sector and from the clothing export sector in the country. Many people don't know this, but over the last few years, there's been a lot of factories opening up, especially in northern Armenia and Banat or Lori and different places that export clothing to Europe. And they're actually very sensitive to the slightest changes in currency. Essentially, in the war of words, the central bank is holding firm that it's not going to interfere and try to lessen the strength of the dram against the dollar and the euro because they say it has many benefits to the economy, such as fighting inflation, lowering our trade deficit, and actually, making our national debt less because of it. And essentially telling business leaders that you simply need to get more efficient and don't expect any help from us. Now, structurally, by law, the Armenian Central Bank only has one mandate, which is inflation, and it has no mandate to interfere in the currency markets. But what central banks say and do are almost always different things. So I don't really expect them to do anything in the current stage, but if the strengthening of the dram continues, and if it goes below 400, I can see them interfering in a backdoor way. Looking at some of the underlying statistics, one of the things that's happened is in the first 4 months of the year, our international trade growth grew by about 34%. In the first 4 months of the year, Armenia's exports grew by 25%, imports grew by 39%. And for the first time, actually, in the first 4 months of the year, our export numbers actually went above $1 billion, which is some of the underlying things that is actually driving the appreciation of the dram. Part of this obviously is related to what has happened from the post-Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is with a large number of Russians that have moved here and the remittances and the income that they're earning from different sources coming into the country, along with we've had very significant growth in tourism, which is quite visible. If you walk around the city, you will see that. So all of this brings us to this point of having a problem, which in a universal sense is actually a good problem to have, but it's obviously something that needs to be managed to limit its negative effects on our overall economy. Now let's move on to the second topic of the week, which is this week's EU's rejection of putting Georgia in line to become a member of the EU, along with countries of Ukraine and Moldova were put on the list. Now this process itself is frankly rather complicated. Getting on the candidacy list does not mean you're going to become a member, or it doesn't even mean you're going to become a member anytime soon, but it is the beginning of the process of becoming a member. Even anyone who's realistic about Ukraine, nobody sees them joining the EU anytime soon. However, this rejection is actually quite traumatic to the Georgian political system, because that's been essentially the guiding principle and the goal of the country for many, many years. It's supported by vast majorities of people in that country, just to join the EU and join NATO. And this was obviously rejected, and this rejection is going to very likely cause an internal political crisis in Georgia between the two very polarized factions, the current government and the opposition that is tied to former President Saakashvili. But in truth, despite the fact that the reasons given by the EU Commission was about backsliding in Georgian democracy, the oligarchic influence on the country, which is specifically talking about the prime minister himself. The real background of this is actually the war in Ukraine. And realistically, this Georgian candidacy in the short or midterm died in the battlefields of Ukraine because the EU, in this case, it does not want to have another zone of conflict with Russia, given the fact that the Russians are very clear about Georgia's membership in NATO and the EU becoming a red line. And this is actually a fine point because the Russians were always softer on the EU than they were on NATO. But in their recent pronouncements, they have made clear that they don't see any difference between the EU and NATO as far as the threat that poses to their perceived national security interests. When you look and actually study the Georgian involvement with the West, and specifically the EU and the United States, there's two essentially periods. It's a 2003 period, which was after the Rose Revolution, and 2008, which was the period following the war with Russia. And what you see is, despite massive number of billions of dollars, somewhere between 5 to 10 billion, depending on who's counting and how, that have been invested in that country, and all of the advantages that Georgia enjoys, from port access to the world, having a regional primary foe that is imperialistic but not genocidal, good relations with the two primary criminal states of the region, a large and successful tourism industry, and all kinds of massive investments from the West. The country is actually underperformed in many dramatic ways, despite all of these positives that I outlined. Their democracy is not much more advanced than Armenia's, and their per capita income is just about equal to Armenia's. And the only thing that you can really point to is that actually a very good infrastructure, especially a road infrastructure, that's been created. But overall, I think this is another one of the factors that's going to lead to a political crisis there, because all of these efforts, frankly, have not been transformative in changing the country as many people had expected. The third and our last item this week, which has really not been covered internationally, is the recent attempted murder of Azeri dissident Mohammed Mirzali. And this is the second or third attempt to actually kill him in his residence in France. This man is obviously in mortal danger of the regime, and I think at this point the only way we can prevent him from being murdered is hopefully having him move to the United States, because generally regimes like Aliyev are very liberal about doing murders in Europe, but they're much more careful about committing these kinds of acts in the United States for many different reasons. This, frankly, should not come as a surprise to anyone. The Aliyev regime has systematically murdered dissidents abroad, kidnapped Azeri journalists abroad, and illegally brought them back to the country. And in the case of Alexander Lamshin, actually kidnapped an Israeli citizen abroad and actually brought him to Baku and on a presidential plane, and proceeded to torture him and put him on trial. So these actions of the regime should not come as a surprise. But all of this makes me think about, you see all these images of, Ilhan Aliyev here and there meeting, Macron, meeting the British Prime Minister and the people, and he's greeted like he is some normal, respectable political leader. And I wonder how many of these people ever read up on just the WikiLeaks articles or the cables that came out, specifically one from American diplomats in Baku, in which in it the entire Aliyev clan in Azerbaijan is actually compared to the Corleones of the movie Godfather fame. And Ilhan himself is actually compared to Vito Corleone's psychopathic son, Sonny. So I wonder to what extent they think about that when they're meeting these people. When I was reading the specific cables from Baku, from Baku to Washington, on this particular matter, I was reminded of a famous line from the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in which he described diplomats as honorable people who go abroad to lie for their country. In this case, whoever this American diplomat was actually an exception to that rule. And I can tell you the way he described the Aliyev clan and Ilhan himself, I don't think no greater truths have ever been spoken in any diplomatic cable in history. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
But when it was your time that the Jew would be the one to hold the strings. Senator Corleone, Governor Corleone, something.
Another peasant of Anta.
Well, this wasn't enough time, Michael. Wasn't enough time.